I'm Bradley Graham. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And it really is a pleasure to welcome back to P&P Adam Gopnik. I think this is his ninth visit to the store. He's, an old friend in many ways. And as many of you undoubtedly are aware, Adam's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he's been for more than 30 years. During his tenure at the magazine, he's been an art critic, Paris correspondent, and chronicler of life in New York. He's written fiction, humor, book reviews, profiles, articles from abroad, and much more, establishing a reputation as one of the country's most incisive and wide-ranging cultural critics. His pieces have won numerous honors, among them 3 National Magazine Awards for essays and criticism, a George Polk Award for magazine reporting, and a French Knight's Medal in Arts and Letters. Beyond his magazine writing, Adam has produced a number of books, several of which have showcased his ability to combine scholarship and analysis with engaging storytelling based on his personal experiences. In his best-selling Paris to the Moon, he examined the peculiarities of French life and the experience of being an expatriate. In Through the Children's Gate, he looked at New York as a parent raising a couple of kids there. And in At the Stranger's Gate, he portrayed the ambition and romance of New York in the 1980s when he and his soon-to-be wife arrived there from Montreal. For all his learned, witty commentary, Adam has said he doesn't think of himself as a public intellectual, in the sense that he doesn't often feel compelled to offer a view on every public question. But he does identify with the tradition of what he's called the ornery amateur scholar, and has labeled himself a 19th century liberal humanist. His new book, 1,000 Small Sanities, is a deeply considered and well-reasoned defense of liberalism. It comes, of course, at a time when the liberal tradition is threatened by such strengthened forces as nationalism, tribalism, and authoritarianism. Adam's book is a relatively small volume, but as he says in a brief note in the back, it's the, quote, end product of a long lifetime's reading of philosophy, history, and biography. And the book's ideas and themes draw on a number of his New Yorker essays. With its customary erudition and charm, Adam presents a compelling, exuberant, and eyes-wide-open argument for liberalism against both the looming authoritarian populist right and the illiberal left. He declares liberalism simply one of the great moral adventures in human history. Now, just to make things even more interesting this evening, to talk with Adam about liberalism, we have a conservative commentator, Andrew Sullivan. Now, Andrew and Adam are old friends, and Andrew really aligns more than you might think with Adam, with his center-right views. And like Adam, Andrew is an accomplished man of many written words who's authored or edited 6 books and committed lots of journalism. In the 1990s, he edited The New Republic, and in 2000 started the blog, The Daily Dish, that he kept going on various platforms for 15 years. Most recently, Andrew's been writing for New York Magazine. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik and Andrew Sullivan.
This is a power chair. You want me here? Yes. All right. Very good. Oh, yes, that's true. It's like the old Crossfire. Does anyone remember, Andrew, when Crossfire was seen? Can you hear me now? Right. All right. I am holding. Can you remember, Andrew, when Crossfire, remember that old show on CNN, was seen as the absolute debasement of political discourse? It was a half-hour-long program where people argued about ideas, and all of us said, oh, my God, it can't get lower than that, can it? There's nothing.
I remember doing it with Pat Buchanan. It was fantastic. Well, I think he's great to argue with.
Yeah, no. But now it looks like it was like a golden age of Athenian.
Yes, it was like the gymnasium.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we're here today to discuss Adam's book and also the fate of liberalism as a political and moral tradition. in the West. It doesn't really exist anywhere else, actually.
No.
It's an entirely Western product. And it's state of siege right now, which is why you're writing this book. Let me just start with a simple question. Tell us about the title. Tell us where it comes from, because when we a year ago we talked about it, and I preferred another title, but nonetheless, tell us about the title.
Absolutely. The title comes, as so many titles do in the history of literature, from my editor, from the publisher. But it actually comes from me. I had written a long piece about incarceration and the politics of mass incarceration, not the politics, the scandal of mass incarceration. And in it, I had talked about what could be done to resolve this terrible crisis. And I said that there was no one enormous thing that was going to have to be done, but you were going to have to pursue solutions on many, many fronts. And though they might look like remedial Band-Aids, they would likely make an enormous change. And then I wrote, 1,000 small sanities are almost always wiser than one big idea. That piece came out in 2011, and indeed that's turned out to be true. For the first time in modern American history, rate of incarceration is going down, and it isn't owed to some huge one piece of legislation. It's owed exactly to 1,000 small sanities making themselves felt one way or another. Andrew's referencing the fact that I wanted to call this book the Rhinoceros Manifesto. Because a rhinoceros makes a very important appearance right in the first 15 pages. Because, as Andrew knows, having read it, the first people you meet, and one of the things I wanted very much passionately to do in this book was make it a book about liberal people rather than a book about liberal principles alone. You meet John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, his great teacher and lover, when they were in the middle of the beginning of their great clandestine love affair because she was married. And they used to meet in front of the rhinoceros cage at the London Zoo in the 1830s. The rhinoceros had been there since 1826. And they would pass each other notes saying, let's see our old friend Rhino today. And they had figured out, being the great philosophers they were, that no one would be looking at the bench to see who was sitting on the bench canoodling. Everyone would be looking at the rhinoceros. But it was on that bench in the London Zoo that they began that great conversation that eventually produced On Liberty and on the subjection of women. And thinking about that wonderful moment, I was thinking about how the rhinoceros is the perfect symbol of liberalism and the liberal mission. It's ugly, ungainly, misshapen. It's a big pig with a horn on it. It's so unappealing that when travelers went to Africa, they came back and reported unicorns when they had actually seen rhinos because they wanted the rhino to look like a unicorn, beautiful with a golden horn and a white mane and the rest of it. And the central metaphor of this book, which Andrew's referring to, is that the unicorn is a perfect symbol of utopian politics, and the rhinoceros is the heraldic animal of liberal politics and of liberalism. You'll be glad to know that after fighting for the Rhinoceros Manifesto and losing it on the grounds that you'll be explaining what the title means instead of talking about the book, the Italian edition of this book will be called Il Manifesto Rhinoceros.
Excellent.
With a picture.
Excellent. I'm very glad to hear it. You have to explain the title of this anyway, so you might as well have had a rhinoceros.
I have had, what's that thing in P.G. Wodehouse, Andrew, editors are like soup in a cheap restaurant. It is wiser not to stir them. And
it's a really good one. I haven't heard that before.
It's Wodehouse, and that was the case here.
Tell me
I'm glad
how
of this title now.
That skepticism of utopia, really, or of massive or a single idea, a unified theory of everything. Why is that different than small c conservatism, which is just as Burke, for example, is very suspicious of grand theories and overarching ideologies that can fix society. So where does the liberal tradition differ from that conservative tradition?
It's a terrific question. Of course, in the book, I try and deal particularly with the figure of Burke, who's so complicated, because in many ways he is what we think of in contemporary terms as a liberal. He spends most of his life trying to get Blackwater basically indicted for war crimes. Yeah, exactly. Trying to get the Hastings, the guy who is guilty of imperial colonial crimes in India, impeached. Literally, that was the word they used. Two reasons, Andrew. I think that, and that's why I begin the book with Mill, because I think, to put it in slightly pedantic terms, I think that Mill saw the folly of utopian politics. In fact, Mill invents the term dystopia Not many people know that. The idea of the anti-utopia, we all talk about dystopian visions of the future. That's John Stuart Mill's invention, that word. And Mill sees clearly the folly and the danger of utopian politics, but he insists that reform is possible nonetheless, and that it's a noble mission for social activists, for politics, to be constantly engaged in reform. That you don't, because you see the danger of revolutionary utopianism, doesn't mean you have to give up on the possibility of steady, ever-increasing reform. And that's what Mill is committed to.
So this concept of progress, basically, is where the center-left leaves the center-right.
Yes, the possibility of progress, which we all recognize can be a folly of its own at times, but also the empirical demonstration of the values of what we call progress. The world is... John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor sat on that bench imagining the case for the complete emancipation of women, not the partial emancipation, not the conditional emancipation. Women should have every civil right and political and economic right that men do. At the time, that seemed like a crazy, quixotic idea that no one took seriously. When Mill died, people still talked about it as though it were a crazy, quixotic idea. And now everyone in this room, even on the right or left, accept it as a necessary moral foundation for liberal democracy. So we liberals say not just is progress possible, but we can point and say that is a wonderful example of how it happens and why it's necessary.
I mean,
and conservatives, admirable, distinguished conservatives, Disraeli, and everyone on the British right, and Burke fought. I was thinking specifically about the idea of women's equality. They fought it. They opposed it. Yes. They saw it as
too much too soon. Yeah. And I have sympathies with that understanding of society, which is that it is an organic, difficult thing to rupture, to reorganize, and that we should be extremely cautious about doing so. And I guess the conservative position then is just we're a little bleaker than you are.
But it's funny you say that, Andrew, because Andrew figures both as a hero and as an antagonist in this book, not directly by name, but certainly by action, because your fight for gay marriage, for marriage equality, is a perfect example to me of the noble moral adventure of liberal reform. I remember very well when you first began writing about gay marriage and the possibilities of gay marriage and the necessity of it. I don't think I'm overstating it to say it was seen as Andrew's quixotic fixation. It was Andrew's hobby horse that would never actually be realized, that was sort of a touching idea to think about in some vague way, but it was clearly never going to happen and was several bridges too far. And now we live. When did you write the book?
That was the book was 95.
Right. So 1995 is when you wrote that book. And
89 was the original essay.
Right. 89. All right. Let's date it all the way back to 1989. And I'm not exaggerating, am I, when I say that's how many people greeted it. Including,
yes, bonkers. I mean, even Virtue Normal, everybody reviewed and said it's all very smart, but this marriage thing is insane.
Yes, exactly.
But anyway,
it's a classic example of the kind that I try and talk about a lot in the book of how liberal reform happens. A few visionaries have the notion. They sit on the rhinoceros bench and they talk to each other and say, "What if? Why not?" And then they put it in the world.
There is a timing question here,
sure.
Though, isn't there? I mean, there is. Is the time ripe for something? Right. And people, my view back then was that in fact, gay couples were everywhere, and most people, if they knew them properly, would be fine with them, and therefore, and something had to be done to recognize this emerging community. Mm-hmm. So I was responding to change that's already happening organically. Yes. But it is a combination of conservatism and liberalism, yes. I agree. But it took time for people to understand it, and you had to go out and persuade people and talk to people and engage with people, which, of course, is the liberal project.
Yes, exactly.
Is discussion.
Reform through reason, exactly. Reform through reason and reform through example. You have the example of gay men and gay women living together successfully, raising families, and it became undeniable. It went from being a fringe project to being a possible project to being an essential project. That's the way liberal reform happens. And one of the things I want to emphasize in this book as strongly as I can is that for me, liberalism isn't a tale of atomized individuals drawing up their isolated social contracts like Robinson Crusoe on his island, accompanied by a native bearer, right, too often. But it's a business of communities. It's a business of having communities that aren't necessarily traditional, but that exactly as you describe, the processes of gay marriage come together in surprising, at times quixotic ways in Greenwich Village or Provincetown or wherever it might be, and begin that process of change.
I'm going to ask you two consecutive questions. Okay. One is a critique of liberalism from the right, and the other is from the left, both of which seems to me are ascendant at this moment in time.
Ascendant? They're fucking triumphant.
Well, yes. Agreed. The if you look at a book like Patrick Deneen's book, the notion that human beings can live without some overarching meaning, with some deep commitment to something that can be transcendently true, he believes is simply against human nature, that you can't construct a society when everybody has completely different ideas of what morality should be, whether God exists, which God is, that this is essentially just an unsatisfying part of liberalism, and that is why it has proven so vulnerable to deeper urges. That there is what I think Rawls called the empty center of liberalism. That in the middle of that town square there is no meaning. There is just the fact that we're all in this together, and we're all trying to protect each other's individual experiences. This doesn't mean to say that liberalism denies the family, the community, blah, blah, blah. But that would be the critique. Why? This is terribly unsatisfying for most people.
Well, I include an argument with Deneen in this book in a long chapter called Why the Right Hates Liberalism. And I tried, Andrew, as passionately as I could to enter sympathetically into those arguments, not scoffingly or dismissively at all. Three things, I think, that need to be said. First, I don't... everyone who makes that critique, the classic Catholic conservative critique, and I include, because I think it's more intellectually distinguished, not just Deneen's right-wing critique, but the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's more left-wing critique, but coming also from a Catholic perspective. He puts it beautifully, puts that critique beautifully.
Well,
he says,
McIntyre,
yes, we could include two. Taylor's Canadian, so I'm biased to him. He says that the central liberal question is who am I, and the central human question is where am I? Where am I positioned in terms of community, family, tradition? And that liberalism, by denying that question, denies a fundamental question of human transcendence and the human identity. It's a powerful point. Three things I'd say. First, every conservative critique of that kind that isn't outright authoritarian, semi-fascist, accepts, as does Deneen, the idea that, of course we're going to continue to have all those nice liberal things. Of course I believe in free elections and a free press and equality of women. Deneen is opposed to gay marriage, as it happens, but they all have a kind of course section. I'm not opposed to those things. And therefore they treat exactly the liberal institutions that empower their speech and everybody else's right now as though they're sort of marginal and fragile, rather than realizing that by making that admission, they have to incorporate liberal institutions into the core of their own critique. And those liberal institutions, just as you said a moment ago, which they tend to deny, are new. They are not things that are just there to be taken. They had to be built and fought for and constructed. So that's my first response. Second response is, I don't think liberalism is without powerful, call them what you will, transcendent spiritual values. You can only say that about liberalism if you don't believe that tolerance and pluralism are values. To my mind, tolerance and pluralism are extraordinary values. They enliven our lives. When we come up, we have a wonderful family tradition that we spend an Andrew evening in Provincetown. My family spends the month of August in Wellfleet, and Andrew's in Provincetown, and every summer we go to spend the evening with Andrew. And one of the things we all love, and you love, I know, about Provincetown, is that it is a community of tolerance and pluralism on the street night after night. Patrick Deneen may find that uninspiring or even sordid. I find it astonishing. Without being gay myself, I think it's amazing to be able to see a community declaring itself without guilt, without shame, to be what it is. That's only possible through liberal values. That's liberal community making it work. So that's the second response I'd make. And the third one, of course, is that we only need look at history to say, okay, how did these organic communities of faith actually work out when they existed in the world. And there the record is not pretty. There the record is a record of persecution, intolerance. We go to Paris and we go to France and we look at Chartres and Reims and the great Gothic cathedrals, and we recognize we'll never build anything. Liberal civilization will never build anything quite that inspiring or beautiful. I'm not blind to that reality. But then I think about if you put medieval France on a border with contemporary France, there's no question which way the traffic would run.
Yeah. Although as politics in France has developed, not quite as sure about that as I used to be.
No.
There is a very strong Catholic far right gaining strength in
And no question about it.
This weekend, Le Pen is almost certainly going to win the European elections in France. So let me go for the others. The other side would say
The left now.
the left. Right. First of all, you are not fully integrating class in all of this.
The left would say, yeah,
yes.
right.
They would say also that you're really just sustaining oppression, and that something far more radical is required to bring about, let's say, climate justice or racial justice, or in this new grand term, social justice, in which liberal norms are actually often the obstacle to getting this stuff done. And your love of increments is actually out of tune with the times, because we actually are facing, for example, a climate catastrophe that's unknown in human history, or we are facing levels of inequality in the society that are making
Intolerable.
democracy
Right.
unsustainable, slowly losing legitimacy with people. So that's why the left is now resurgent, by which I mean the sort of neo-Marxist left.
Yes, not
Blair, Obama,
Nancy Pelosi.
center-left
Right.
politics.
Even though they are often called left.
No,
by,
I mean, Obama was a liberal, absolutely. Even on questions of race,
Yes.
very emphatically liberal, not left.
Right.
Opposed to identity politics altogether.
Opposed to reparations, for instance,
Yes.
and those questions.
So tell me, liberalism is under siege. Most of the center-left parties in Europe have collapsed, or they have been taken over by a far-left
Right.
sentiment.
So the next...
How does liberalism defend itself against that particular sally?
So the next chapter in the book is why the left hates liberalism, and there are three. And so let me give you three responses to that assault, which I agree with you, which you've described perfectly, and is very powerful now. Probably not in numbers, but certainly in volume. And
in power.
Increasingly in power. I think three things have to be said. One is that we have an obligation. Liberals have an obligation to do a lot of moral accountancy. That's one of the liberal tasks. And I begin that chapter of the book, the left-wing attack, with a moment when my son Luke came to me, someone Andrew knows well, in great distress, because he said, I was in the middle of writing a review for the New Yorker of one of Timothy Snyder's books on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And he said, Dad, why are you writing one more piece about the Jewish Holocaust, and you've never written a piece about the Holocaust in the Congo at the beginning of the 20th century? Because he had been learning about it in high school. And he said that was a case where the people you most admire, the European liberals, were guilty of colonial Holocaust on an unimaginable level. Now, I could make the case that it wasn't really the liberals who were running Belgium at the time, but there's no question that was part of the concert of European civilization at the time. And the answer is that it was horrible. And it's true, and it's part of the moral accountancy of liberalism has to do, is an accountancy for colonialism and imperialism and its exploitation and its horrors. What I pointed out to Luke, after I'd studied it a little bit more closely, is that the world became aware of the Belgian Holocaust in the Congo because of an extraordinarily brave journalist named Morel, E.M. Morel, who was working in Britain. He's an amazing man, again, one of the kind of brief lives I tried to put in the book, who was working as a shipping clerk, or clerk, as they would have called him in London. And he saw that what was coming back was rubber, were goods, and what were going out were manacles and guns. And he sort of made the connection in his head that why are we sending out manacles and guns to the Congo and then bringing back in the goods? And he began to explore it, investigate it, did a brilliant Cy Hirsch-like job of figuring out what was going on, got it into the newspapers, formed a committee, was chaired actually by Arthur Conan Doyle, and began the whole familiar liberal process of pointing to an atrocity, as you did bravely, Andrew, when you turned your view on the Iraqi War because of what had happened at the exposure of Abu Ghraib and the atrocities there, and pointed it out. What does that mean? It means that part of the liberal project, part of the liberal tradition, is to insist on installing a corrective conscience at the heart of your institutions. That's why we have newspapers. It's why we have a free press. It's why we have liberal universities. Even though I suffer from them, I have no sympathy with people who say, oh, we shouldn't have radicals tenured at liberal universities. That's the point of having a liberal university, is to protect profound dissenting opinion.
Yeah.
Right.
It would be nice if there was someone other than
all right.
We've just got to accept that, I guess, at this point.
But that's it.
Or that these radicals were interested in tolerating other views.
Right.
So
let's move to that. let's move to that. So that's first response. Liberalism, of course, has moral accountancy to do, but it tries to impose that moral accountancy in its institutions, and that's not just talk. It's not just noise. That's actually what happens. On the train down from Philadelphia today, I was actually reading Seymour Hersh's autobiography, which is a very good book, and which is just about how the My Lai massacre, which we still have not sufficiently grasped and understood as part of America's burden and America's history, went from being a rumor to something that was on the front page and in Life magazine. That actually happens. Liberal free speech is not just a mask for oppression. Second thing I'd say is that though we have an obligation as liberals to engage in that kind of moral accountancy, the left has an equal obligation to invest in moral accountancy for why the Marxist and radical revolutions of the 20th century went so wrong. Not a little bit wrong, not partway wrong, not with a mixed balance sheet, but why they were moral and intellectual catastrophes of an almost unequaled kind. And I don't see that work being done with any real energy or vigilance. Because I think if you did that work on the true left, you'd move very rapidly. You'd have to move in a social democratic direction and recognize the indispensability of liberal institutions like free speech, free debate, and so on, which were never instantiated in any Marxist society that was available. And the third thing I'd say is that the liberal, if you actually, again, as with the right, you ask about the right and you say, well, look at what theocratic states are actually like. They're not organic paradises. They're inquisitorial infernos more often than not. And in the same way, you say, look at the liberal record of actual reform. Look where we are now. It's utterly imperfect. Liberalism begins with an acceptance of the total imperfection of human beings and of human society, that we are all fallible. But the record's not bad. The record, in fact, is very good. If you look at our societies are totally imperfect, but if you value prosperity and pluralism, liberal democracies have done better than any other societies known to history.
I would also add, not to just agree with you, that in terms of race and gender and other things, liberalism has actually created an astonishing culture that would be unrecognizable to almost anybody from previous centuries in terms of, and yet the left is absolutely insistent that things are worse now than they have ever been.
I think you can only say that if you have a terrible historical amnesia. Now, I understand the sources of that amnesia, and they're not unhealthy in lots of ways too. Impatience is a political virtue, especially on the part of the young, which I guess we no longer can count ourselves as being. And so I understand that. I also think, and as you may have noticed, this is where David Frum, in a very friendly review, argued with me in the New York Times. He says, well, Gopnik is really kind of a secret lefty. He basically shares a lot of values with the left, but he just wants them to sort of be nicer, and he refuses to look them in the eye and see how illiberal they actually are.
I think that's a very unfair assessment. I mean, I do think you look them right in the eye and call them out in a way that very few liberals are currently doing. Why have liberals surrendered to the left?
Two reasons, I think. One, a simple, powerful one: fear. Right? Nobody wants to be. We've talked about this. Mobbed up on. The other reason, and I think this is a good reason. That's a bad reason. One of I think your heroes, certainly one of mine, the great Christian writer C.S. Lewis said once that courage is not the one of the virtues. It is the type of all the virtues. And I believe that to be profoundly true. So courage is what's required there. I also think it's true because it is absolutely the case. I'm going to spin over around here like Dean Martin addressing the Cape Cod Melody Tent. That
Quite.
well, I'm just circling around here. I can begin to sing if that would bring it up, because there's a long history of vindication where radical ideas have turned out to be essential and radical action have turned out to be essential for liberal reform. And one of the key figures in my book is the guy I think of as the greatest American, Frederick Douglass. And one of the things that makes Frederick Douglass so endlessly interesting is that he was both. He was both an impatient radical prophet and a practical liberal politician. And he played both roles in succession throughout his life. And we miss the point of Douglass if we merely make him into a Republican, in those days, Republican Party politician, although he was completely. That was one of the roles he played. But we also miss his significance if we make him into a fierce prophet of abolition at any cost, including through violence.
And the same could be said for Lincoln, although probably...
Totally, yeah. Totally.
Where do you, let me just, before we go to you guys, because we will in a second, we're coming up to Memorial Day, and the President of the United States is going to use that occasion to pardon war criminals of some of the people who've been convicted in the military justice system, people who were reported by their fellow soldiers. There's nothing we can do about this. Why is liberalism failing right now in the political system to restrain the demagogic strongman position that we're now seeing emerge throughout the West?
It's the reason I wrote this book, to try and recuperate a little morale on that part. I share your sense, Andrew, that we are in the midst of, and I think I will say I give myself, I have no credit because I wish it hadn't happened, a little credit for prescience in saying 3 years ago or 4 years ago about Donald Trump that he was not a harmless celebrity TV oaf, but a living danger to constitutional values. Andrew, you were the only person I knew whose mind I respected who said unequivocally in 2016, he's going to win. He's absolutely going to win. And you, sadly, even though you saw him...
But I think we both had the same sense that Trump is an absolute danger,
an existential danger.
I had conversations with liberals who were thrilled that Trump was the nominee because it would mean they would be destroyed.
Right.
And they were gleeful about this. And I just think that they misunderstood. Now maybe liberalism needs to keep in touch with illiberals, which is the natural state of humankind, right? Human beings are not naturally liberal.
No.
In fact, it is an extremely counterintuitive human emotion to be liberal. That's why liberalism as a concept has really only existed for a split second, really, in the history of humanity.
And could be snuffed out tomorrow. We've seen it being snuffed out around the world, in Turkey right now, throughout Eastern Europe. It's, Turkey was a liberal democracy of a peculiar kind, but a real one for a long time. Here's what I'd say. Let me answer both the practical question, and then the deeper existential question. And in terms of the immediate practical question, it's clear that liberals and liberalism have done a very bad job, as you were saying earlier, of addressing fundamental questions of identity and what I can only call patriotism in their discourse. Quick story, my son Luke, who I've mentioned before, though not a political activist, went to work on the Max Rose campaign in Staten Island in 2018. I don't know if many of you know about that campaign, but though AOC got all the attention, winning a Brooklyn district that not even I could lose if I were the Democratic candidate, Max Rose was an Army veteran who went into the deepest red district in all of New York City, and one of the deepest in New York State, where the Republican candidate had won in Trump's election by 45 percentage points. And they had to go in and fight for Max Rose. What did they have to learn to do, Andrew? They had to learn how to talk plausibly as liberal arts college students to people whose instincts were full of fears about health insurance, full of fears about their lives, but who had 2 and sometimes 3 American flags on their front porch, and that was central to their identity. And these kids had to learn to talk a plausible form of patriotism to those folks. And it was very moving for me because day after day, Luke would come back on the Staten Island ferry and talk about the people he had to learn from in order to fight Max Rose's cause. And I'm glad to say that they won that race. Max Rose won by 6 percentage points, turned it around by 46%. That was a much more significant congressional race than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because that's got to be the model, the practical model going forward, learning how to talk that kind of talk. And
yet there's a considerable body of opinion within the Democratic Party that that's not the way to go. That those people will never. First of all, these people are privileged. First of all, we shouldn't be on their side, and secondly, that we should rally a new coalition of liberal intellectuals and wealthy woke people in places like this, along with racial minorities, gays, and all the others, and that will win.
Well,
that was roughly Clinton's approach, really, that belief.
Didn't we see how it worked? Obama always said, and I'm still a great admirer of President Obama, Obama always said, you can't win all those folks, as he would put it. You can't win all those folks, but you can lose fewer of them. And that was the way, and that was what the Obama coalition did, and that's what Obama's politics did. So at a practical level, I think we need to do that. At the deeper sort of philosophical, existential level, I both agree and disagree with you about whether human beings are naturally liberal. Certainly in our sense, liberalism, exactly as you say, has been this tiny eye blink in the history of human beings. And yet, in another way, and this is one of the themes of this book, of my book, is that liberalism isn't a political ideology applied to human life. It's what we know about life applied to political ideology. And I mean by that, I was thinking about something very specific. I did a lecture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art 5 or 6 years ago. They had a great show called Jerusalem 1000. And it was a show about how at the beginning of that momentous century, Jews and Christians and Muslims had all coexisted in Jerusalem reasonably well. Not perfectly, but they bought and sold from each other. They made goods for each other. They each understood what part of the city was theirs. They respected each other as places of worship. They managed. They coexisted peacefully. And yet, by the end of that century, it was all gone. It was massacre and counter-massacre. The Christians massacred the Muslims massacred the Christians, and everybody massacred the Jews. That, in the classic historic pattern. And when I was thinking about that, Andrew, I thought, what is the core of liberalism? It's simply saying, let's make the normal human practice of coexistence, which is essential to being able to live at all, let's make that practice of coexistence into a principle of pluralism. That's what liberalism attempts to do, into a permanent principle of pluralism. So it may fail, but I think that the underlying human instincts towards social sympathy with people unlike ourselves are not ultimately defeatable. And in that sense, I think liberalism is a human instinct.
Or maybe liberalism survived as long as it was producing amazing amounts of prosperity. People were bribed into thinking, well, sure, that's that. The minute, and also I would say that mass immigration has clearly had a huge impact on the viability of liberalism. The fact that liberals do not have a language to speak about nationhood or borders or countries in a way that conservatives can even understand or hear, has obviously led to the far right gaining and the far left to some extent gaining everywhere.
There's no question. I would put it slightly differently. I would say that if you don't have a plausible, I hate to use the word rhetoric, you don't have a plausible idea of patriotism, it will necessarily, like a subatomic particle, break down into nationalism. I think that is so, and I think that's true.
Yeah. My deeper fear about this, Adam, is we did have a president who for 8 years made a very sophisticated liberal argument about all of us getting along, that actually had a patriotic story of America as a series of unfoldments and of expansion. And he did so with unsurpassed rhetorical brilliance and genius, and then re-elected Trump immediately thereafter. If Obama couldn't bring that sense of a liberal community together, who could? And is it possible in a truly, is there a point at which liberalism's pluralism becomes so out of control, and this would be the ancient critique of democracy, that there's far too many issues and disagreements and entire worldviews that it becomes completely impossible to understand the country as a single unit. And I think, and certainly I think that's happened all over Europe, partly because of largely because of mass immigration that has really triggered a visceral and not pleasant, ugly, but real force. But anyway, let's. There are two microphones. One is there, and one is there. And you've heard us blather on too much.
I thought we were blathering rather well.
That's
I thought we were
little
blathering rather cogently.
Self-effacement.
British, the necessary British self-abasement.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
In debate. The opposite of Jewish self-aggrandizement.
I guess this is primarily for Adam, but Andrew is encouraged really to chime in here. Well, given the sort of the definition of liberalism that you just said, with pluralism kind of at the center, what are the implications? I haven't read the book, so what are the implications for economics, for class? You've referred only very briefly to the need for liberals to consider class and so forth. So if you would just talk economics a little bit on the base.
I don't set myself up not as an economist, but not as a political pundit. I'm an essayist, and I like writing primarily about people and their passion for ideas. But what I'd say broadly is that there's no question that liberal democracies have produced enormous prosperity. They've produced it along with it because that's what free markets do. They produce inequality. They produce enormous inequality. And they produce cycles of booms and busts. What the question is are they capable of being alleviated? Are there remedial measures we can take that can keep the engines of prosperity without having the noxious consequences of growing economic inequality and the terrifying cycles of booms and busts that devastate lives? And I would suggest that there's a lot of evidence that you can do those things. Now, in America, since the 1980s at least, we haven't been doing those things. We've managed to strip away so many of the governors we put on the free market engine. We haven't done a good job at all of one of the most powerful ways of reducing economic inequality in every bit of social science you look at is something that my sister Allison, who sits here, has campaigned for her whole life, and that is pre-K education. The single strongest antidote to economic inequality is early education, kindergarten to pre-kindergarten to kindergarten. There are lots of remedial efforts that have been made in the world in liberal states that can be made again, that must be made again, that can begin to reduce when we talk about questions of class, it's not class that bothers us, it's class inequality that bothers us. It's not that we think that some people shouldn't be blue collar workers and some people white collar workers. It's that we don't want the economic fate of those two different peoples to be too different. We don't want it to be radically unlike. People now forget, but at the height of the so-called post-war boom, the top income tax rate was 90%, and it kicked in when you made $1 million. I don't know if that's desirable, but it certainly shows it wasn't a barrier to wealth. So as a liberal, I'm persuaded that it's possible to take all of those kinds of remedial reforms to create a more equitable economic world. And I think that the alternatives are either right-wing authoritarianism of the Trumpist kind, which manages to serve only the top 0.01%, while selling a program of nationalism, or some kind of utopian appeal to a Marxist state, radical state, which has been shown historically to be unsuccessful. So that's my long-winded answer to your succinct question.
Ma'am.
Thank you for being here and blathering, I think, rather brilliantly. My question is about history. Your son was talking about why not the Congo, and you've talked about why haven't we done in our moral accountancy a good kind of beady-eyed look at the legacy of communism. And my question is a practical one. How much time needs to elapse before people can write good histories? I mean, clearly that we're overdue on the Congo side, but what about communism?
Well, I think there have been some terrific histories of communism. I think of Robert Conquest, for instance, the great British historian who wrote, I think you knew, did you not, Andrew? No, it did. But in any case, Robert Conquest, one of the great historians of Soviet experiment, and tried to explain to people like our mutual and departed friend Chris Hitchens, back when Hitchens was of the left, you don't understand what you're actually talking about, because this is what happened there. So we have Conquest, we have Anne Applebaum, whose books I'm sure are on sale here, and I think lives here in Washington, doesn't she? And Anne Applebaum wrote a great book about the Ukrainian mass famine, the imposed, created mass famine only last year. So I think there's a lot of good stuff. When it comes to our own history, it's so much still in play. One of the things that most shook me up was to discover through a very good history, a new history of the American Revolution, which came from the left. That in Hamilton, the great Lin-Manuel's great musical, the Battle of Yorktown is the climax of Act One, enacted entirely by minority actors. One of the most stirring things I've ever seen on the stage. But at the Battle of Yorktown, many slaves, American slaves, had taken refuge behind the British lines with the British because they would be emancipated that way. And after the Americans won, those slaves were returned to their masters, including Jefferson and Washington. That's the kind of moral accountancy that we continue to need to do. And that's why, if I may say so, that's why a place like this is such a miraculous citadel of liberal civilization. You can go up and down these shelves and find those histories and find those truths, and you can buy the ones you want and make those choices. When I talk about liberal institutions, in a certain sense, the last thing I mean are legislatures. I think that free libraries, bookstores, college seminar rooms are even more important.
Yeah, there is a weird liberal blind spot when it comes to communism. I remember, and I see it even now. You can see people walking around with a little cap, a Mao cap, that's from the Cultural Revolution. I mean, and it's as if they don't know what that was and how unbelievably hideous and evil it was. And they wouldn't be walking around with a swastika on there. No. But there's some kind of weird, this is my issue with liberals, is that they're so pusillanimous when it comes to the left. They really don't fight. They're too full of guilt, I think, to fight back. But you're not one of them. Well, anyway.
Well, I would put it differently, Andrew. It's that we don't believe in fighting back. We believe in arguing and persuading, and we'll go on arguing and persuading and losing till infinity. Lady here.
Actually, that's a perfect lead on to what I was going to ask you about or speak to. Back to what you said about Obama and what he represented in terms of the liberal view and pluralism, and then the rise of Donald Trump. I can't help but think that we're missing something here and assuming that there was this group of people just waiting for Trump. I think Trump awakened something and brought a lot of people along with him. I'm not convinced that if Obama or someone like him weren't running against Trump, that they wouldn't have won. Right. So my question following on what you just said is, it's first of all what you think of that. And secondly, why aren't liberals speaking up? This is a big, huge problem we have right now. We don't have strong liberal voices. Trump, day after day, gets attention with whatever it is he spews out, but we don't have much happening on the other side.
Sure. I think.
How do we make that happen?
So, two responses. First question, I think two things. We can never underestimate the role of chance and contingency. If Barack Obama could have run for a third term, he would have won a third term. I think that's very highly probable. And then we'd be living in a different country. And that happens all the time. So we should never overrate. Nothing is determined. Nothing is fated. The second thing I think worth saying is we should not overinvest in what I called once in the New Yorker presentism, the belief that whatever is happening now is going to go on, continuing to happen indefinitely. And we also shouldn't say that because something good is replaced by something bad, that negates the good thing that happened. That's one of the great, I wrote a long essay about Reconstruction in American history not long ago. And one of the things that Henry Louis Gates points out in his new book is that the gains of Reconstruction, when it was active, were very real for African Americans. And though they were ultimately futile in the immediate future, they were not to be dismissed. Those were real gains that helped build real social capital and real institutions. So we should never despair because a good thing is replaced by a bad thing. Finally, why aren't there more fighting liberal voices, more passionate liberal voices? This is why I wrote this book.
I know it.
That's
Thank
why
you.
that's why I wrote this book. But also I'd be inclined to say that some of the wisest, I wonder sometimes, and Andrew, who knows him, would have a probably clearer view on this than I would. I've asked myself many times why Barack Obama particularly has been silent for so much of the last 3 years. And it's disturbing to me, for instance, when he releases his schedule of projects he's developing with Netflix, but doesn't speak up unequivocally about pardoning war criminals who the army despises, who the soldiers despise. And I think, having tried to understand it, I think it's his sense that the more you fuel this particular fire, the worse it gets. That figures like Trump, and Trump particularly, live like professional wrestlers out of the grotesqueries of combat. I know that Mayor Pete feels that way very strongly, that the worst thing you can do is continue to pay attention to it and allow Trump and Trumpism to dictate your own values and your own attitudes. But I'm with you that I think that we need more edge and fight and passion in presenting liberal ideas, not as wishy-washy centrism, but as a passionate pursuit of a greater moral goal.
Ma'am, over here.
Thank you. I really love ideas, and I think liberals like ideas. But the older I get, the more I think we practice, and we're always practicing something. And as an educator, I kind of feel I'm wondering what you think. I guess what I feel like is we have to educate towards liberalism. It's not natural to our brains and how our brains work. Our brains work towards creating, making sure we're secure, that we belong to community, and that we have dignity, right? And so we have to educate towards liberalism. And I'm just interested in your perspective on how to educate towards that. I feel in some ways Enlightenment education has really failed in our country.
Sure. So two things I'd say. One is I completely agree that education is the central liberal project and the central liberal institution. Public schools are parents, I have two of my amazing sisters here tonight. Our parents were the children of uneducated immigrants, and yet they went on to get PhDs and go to fancy schools and all that, strictly on fellowship, strictly by a meritocratic system of advancement. I know many people quarrel with that kind of meritocracy, but I'm all for it. How could I not
It's
be?
white supremacy.
Yes.
Meritocracy. It is.
But you had a similar ascension from...
Yeah, no, my parents didn't. No one in my family went to college before I did.
Right. And so I think that's hugely important that we continue to make education central. The other thing I'd add is I think there's a kind of, in addition to formal education, there's a sort of process of empirical education that can go on. Andrew mentioned before how Brexit was motivated above all by immigration, by mass immigration and the panic it made. But what struck me about it, and I remember we were talking about this right after the Brexit vote, is that you were saying that was why many of your relatives voted. But what was interesting is that Londoners, many of those folks, and it's certainly true in France, and it's certainly true about Trumpites in Wisconsin or Michigan, have the least actual experience of immigrants. In London, where people actually live every day with immigrants, with Muslims, with Asians, they don't vote for Brexit. They're much more familiar with it. New York City, where the immigrant experience, where coexistence is part of your daily empirical education, has even after 9/11, had no problems with glorifying, with celebrating the immigrant experience. So I think that kind of empirical education is one of the powerful tools of liberalism.
But surely it's salient that, you look at what's happening in the New York City school system, the chancellor, who's dedicated opponent of liberalism, and indeed in our universities, in which liberalism is currently despised essentially by a vast majority of the academics that now have tenure and power. I think liberalism is partly in danger because the left has essentially captured the educational system in order to, and it has effects. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've always been attracted to the Judas Sklar, the liberalism of fear. Cruelty is the worst thing we do, and I wondered if you have anything to say about that in your book.
Yes, well, I do something that intellectually is a little heretical, which is instead of tracing the origins of liberalism, of liberal humanism, to Montesquieu and Locke and those very familiar and important philosophical names, I trace it back to Montaigne, the great French essayist, the great French Renaissance humanist, because Montaigne's central insight, which doesn't occur anywhere really in human thought before, is that compassion is the chief of all virtues, and that all of our capacity to be human depends on our feelings of sympathy for other people's suffering. That's all we need to be moral. We don't need a God. We don't need rules. We just need sympathy for other people's suffering, even for an animal suffering. It's a great essay about killing a stag, which is totally normal, going hunting, and says, think about how the stag feels after it's been hunted, and your whole view of the world will change. So absolutely, I'm with Montaigne in thinking that a campaign against cruelty is the heart of the liberal project.
Yes, sir.
Okay, gentlemen.
Last question.
I have a question for you, Andrew, about Adam's book, and it's not, is it good? The question is specifically with young people. So you have consecutive chapters in your book about why the right hates liberalism and why the left hates liberalism. Now with young people, you kind of see them flowing into each camp, but for different reasons. Right, with kind of the intellectual dark web presence, the anti-immigrant pressures,
the alt-right,
the alt-right. But even a watered-down version of the alt-right, where it's not just, there's a light version. And then with the left, often through the education system and college and everything. Which side do you see as a bigger threat going forward, specifically with young people?
It's very hard to pick. Look, I think there are several things, especially with young people. And the first is that liberal capitalism has failed them. And I think that my own view is that being on the right center, I think the right of center has to come to terms with the failure of capitalism at this stage in making most people's lives better. And if you talk to people under 40, essentially, certainly in Europe, they can't afford anywhere to live. The jobs they have are very precarious and not very well paid. They are saddled with enormous debt, and indeed the consequence of, and this is the other thing I think we have to accept, that we have had a period of what we might call neoliberalism, but in which liberalism has been ascendant, and at the end of that period,
Economic liberalism, free market.
Economic, yes,
Economic
but also to some extent within a political liberal system. And I think you could think of Blair as a liberal, for example. I think you could think of Thatcher and that element of the right in some ways as liberalizing, as much they believe in the individual. They want. But
they don't. But that's a complicated argument.
It is complicated.
But all right.
I think of Montaigne as the founder of conservatism. But anyway, so I think they're particularly pressured, and I think they are particularly angry at the previous elites, and they recognize the previous elites were or are liberal, and therefore the tendency to switch to the far left. What has surprised me a little bit is that there hasn't been more sort of rebellion in the universities. There hasn't been a sense that it's the first time students are actually activists and campaigning in league with their professors. They're not attacking the professors, they're not attacking the established order. They are the children of these extremists. My worry is, and I see this happening a lot, is that especially people who've gone through this education system, which has basically been changed by the left, that they get very angry at some point. There is a backlash to that. I see, especially with young men who end up feeling through their education that they've been told consistently there's something wrong with them because they're male and something wrong with them because they're white, and these have to be counted, and are very angry about it. I've watched my own brother go from a very moderate person to someone really on the far right. In the men's rights movement now, Brexit, this is powerful among the younger generation. And I think we have to try and persuade them that the liberal project
Some
is
version
still
of it,
valid,
right.
despite the failure, the classic failure of liberalism for that generation. I think that's another thing that one has to consider.
Let me add on. Right. Let me add only to that, and when I think it's a caveat and a warning that's essential. Let me add to that only that if in our conversations, Andrew, over the years, I tend too much to the fatuously bland, I think you'd agree that you tend sometimes to the alarmist. Yeah. But so let me just say,
But sometimes I've been right.
Yes.
I really don't think if you look at what's happening in Europe right now, being a drama queen is the only thing to be. I mean, we're beginning to see neo-fascist governments arriving in all the
And
major
sustained.
European capitals. And we're going to see in the European elections this weekend a massive majority for the far right in the European Parliament. You have openly neo-Nazi parties in Germany. You see all of Eastern Europe and those countries become extraordinarily authoritarian. I see Britain, a usually pragmatic, sensible, generally speaking, not that radical people. I mean, they're known for common sense. And they are tearing themselves apart. Theresa May will not be prime minister, probably in a month. She may be forced to announce her resignation tonight, actually, or tomorrow. And Boris Johnson is going to be the next prime minister of the United Kingdom.
who went to school with Andrew? It's
I
a
went
real
to school with him.
problem.
And he'll be prime minister by the middle of the summer. And he will be leading Britain out of the EU with no deal. And that's going to happen. So things are really out of whack here. And when I see the record of Trump in this country, and you see that the Democratic contenders are actually not that far ahead of him, really, I think we have a problem.
I agree. I agree that we have a problem because we have a problem. It's not just a problem; it's an emergency. Is the reason why I left the practice of the comic essay and wrote this book. This what I hope is a testament of liberal faith. The one thing I'd say is that the world is an unpredictable place. You know, you're talking about how kids react. I have two kids, both went through schooling in which the progressive pieties were inculcated into their bodies day after day, and they both have gone from my left over here to my right in the space of it as a reaction, as a critical reaction to
It's healthy.
what they've learned, which is the normal thing to have happen. The other thing I'd say is that always to remember that the present is not always the future, and that when we talk about what people feel, what countries feel, we're always projecting onto a very complicated reality. It's true that young people, and I live with it every day, feel themselves to be in some ways cheated. Millennials feel themselves cheated by the system. I share an office at the New Yorker with someone who's 30 years younger than I am, and she said to me once, your generation was ambitious. We just want things to be adequate. And I thought that was a great title for a millennial memoir, Adequate, and searching for it. But at the same time, when you think about it, right, the most energetic, the most creative parts of the United States, New York and California and so on, are overwhelmingly liberal still. They are overwhelmingly resistant to Trumpism and nationalism, just as London is overwhelmingly resistant to Brexit, and as the young people, the single greatest divide in the Brexit vote was between the old and the young. So when I look at those signs, I see little faint candle light glimmers of hope at the end of a very long and very dark tunnel.
I see no hope at all. Anyway.
Thank you all for coming. That was great. Thank you. Thank you.